Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 6 of The Devil's Brood, The Fall of the King. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Henry had forgiven his sons Richard and Geoffrey after the Great Revolt, and granted them more authority over their respective duchies of Aquitaine and Brittany. Moreover, his rival Louis, the King of France, had died, leaving the throne to his son Philip, a sickly teenager. So Henry was the dominant power in Western Europe. Despite his astonishing success, Henry does not appear to have learned from his mistakes, since he refused to give any actual authority to his official heir, Henry the Younger. Restless, the young king meddled in a conflict between Richard and several of his more powerful vassals in Aquitaine. As expected, Richard reacted with violence. The conflict escalated as Geoffrey sided with the young king, and Henry backed Richard. The family squabble had confined itself mostly to Aquitaine, but was drawing in the neighboring powers of Toulouse, Burgundy, and Aragon, threatening to spark a major war, when Henry the Younger died suddenly of dysentery on June 11th, 1183. Since everyone's ranking as heirs had changed, Henry thought it made sense to rearrange their holdings as well. While Richard and Geoffrey had been busy running their respective duchies, John had spent his adolescence promised as a groom to various heiresses to solidify control of parts of Henry's growing empire. As the fourth son, John should have had little future, but Henry seemed to care for him, probably hurt by his other sons' numerous revolts against him. Determined to give John a generous inheritance, Henry made a severe miscalculation that would provoke yet another revolt. Richard was informed that he would take his deceased brother's position as official heir and nominal overlord of England and Normandy, while John would receive Aquitaine. It is important to remember that Richard had grown up expecting that his older brother would rule England and Normandy, so he had little attachment to them. Having seen the frustration felt by his older brother, and having spent most of the past decade imposing his will on Aquitaine, Richard answered that he needed time to think, and then made his way to Aquitaine, where he sent a message that he would never give up the duchy. Since the two main powers in Aquitaine were Richard and the various rebel lords, there was little that Henry could do, but he still managed to make the situation worse. Rather than recognize that he had seriously misjudged Richard, Henry told John that he would have to take Aquitaine by force. Given John's complete lack of military experience, it would have been rash, bordering on suicidal, to take on Richard. Fortunately, he had aid from his other brother, Geoffrey, who had received the estate of Richmond in England to make up for Richard becoming principal heir. Having obtained what he wanted, Geoffrey seemed to have been loyal to his father, not Richard, especially since he was now second in line for the throne behind a man who routinely risked his life and was unmarried. It was easy for Geoffrey to be patient, since it did not look like he would have to wait long for his inheritance. Whether the death of his heir had aged him, or just a lifestyle of constant movement had taken its toll, Henry was 50 and showing his age. His hair was gray, he had put on weight, and he was bow-legged with a limp. The two brothers invaded Aquitaine in the fall of 1184. Provoking Richard to raid Brittany, deepening the division within the Angevin Federation. Henry tried to force his three sons to reconcile in December, even releasing Eleanor for the occasion, proving once again that he had failed utterly to comprehend his wife's attachment to her ancestral duchy. Henry had hoped that Eleanor would accept the transfer of Aquitaine to John, but unsurprisingly, she refused to disinherit her favorite son. Finally, accepting that he could not dislodge Richard from Aquitaine without a civil war, Henry decided to give John lands somewhere else. While John had emerged from the conflict empty-handed, Geoffrey's loyalty paid off, since Henry assigned him to be regent in Normandy over the winter, as if he was considering making Geoffrey his heir. 4 months later, he returned to Brittany, and Henry clearly trusted him, actually needed him to balance Richard, since he finally handed over Nantes. John did not have a place in the hierarchy, even though he was now 18. After turning down an offer from the Patriarch of Jerusalem for John to succeed the leopard King Baldwin, Henry sent his youngest son to be King of Ireland in 1185. Actually, John was officially Lord of Ireland because no pope had agreed to sanction the coronation. To be honest, it would be difficult for John to become Lord of Ireland since the Normans did not fully control the island, which was divided into a number of smaller kingdoms. The Norse had invaded in the 8th and 9th centuries, establishing ports in Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, and Cork that had become key trading communities by the 12th century. However, these coastal trading centers had little connection to the rest of Ireland since there were few roads and bridges, which made it difficult, if not impossible, for a single ruler to gain control of the entire island. As a result, an ever-shifting political landscape saw a flow of local leaders achieve dominance and then fall to be replaced by another leader. When Henry had arrived in 1171 to prevent Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke and King of Leinster, known as Strongbow, from becoming the dominant ruler, he had left Hugh de Lacy as Justiciar of Ireland and King of Meath with control of Dublin. An extremely effective leader, de Lacy soon gained firm control of the neighboring kingdom of Leinster following Strongbow's death in 1177, so John would have to handle de Lacy very carefully. Actually, Henry had prepared the way for John by removing de Lacy as Justiciar of Ireland, and he spent a fortune to ensure that John looked like a king, but the money was wasted. John was knighted on March 31st, 1185, and sailed for Ireland 3 weeks later. His arrival did not start well. Henry had sent experienced men to advise them, but John felt no need to listen to them. The younger members of his entourage openly mocked the Irish lords who met with John, so the various Irish kings refused to pay homage. New lords always had to strike a delicate balance between satisfying the greed of their followers and the desire of the existing inhabitants to keep their land. John quickly demonstrated that he could not manage that balance, giving castles to his favorites, thus angering the Norman aristocracy who should have been his closest allies. Many of his soldiers deserted, and de Lacy remained dangerous, even though he had lost his authority as justiciar. 8 months in Ireland had simply proven that John lacked Richard's military ability and Geoffrey's political skills. Clearly, he was too immature for responsibility, which is strange, since he was older than Geoffrey and Richard were when they took over their duchies. To be honest, the imposition of Angevin authority would take patience and time, probably years, but John did not possess patience, so he returned to England in the fall. The situation in Ireland suddenly appeared favorable the following year, since de Lacy was assassinated on July 26, but before John could return, news arrived of Geoffrey's death in Paris on August 19th. As the second son, not the third, John had become too important for Ireland. Why was Geoffrey in Paris, you ask? Well, strange as it may sound, Alice was the cause. Meeting with Philip in March, Henry had promised that Richard would marry Alice, and Philip had accepted the transfer of the Vexin to her dowry, which would hopefully motivate Henry to finally permit the marriage to take place. While the prospect of peace was probably welcome news to anyone who lived near the Norman border, the agreement was bad news for Geoffrey, since Richard would be given Normandy and presumably England and Anjou in addition to his Duchy of Aquitaine. Although he had proven both loyal and effective, Geoffrey was apparently expected to be satisfied with receiving the estate of Richmond and the county of Nantes, which were his wife's inheritance anyway. However, he was now second in line for the throne, so Brittany may no longer have seemed enough, especially since he was the only son with an heir. Frustrated in his ambition, Geoffrey turned to the only other option, Philip. Negotiations were secret, so little is known about the actual goals. Since Philip made Geoffrey Seneschal of France, a position that usually belonged to the Count of Anjou, they may have hoped to take Anjou from Henry. Given Anjou's close connection to the Duchy of Brittany, this would have been the logical choice. Ducal charters granted in Nantes were witnessed by lords across the border in Anjou, showing that Geoffrey was making connections there. It is unclear what would have resulted from the inevitable revolt, but Geoffrey died from wounds received during a tournament, which upset the fragile peace. A meeting in February 1187 raised again the subject of Alice, Richard's long-term fiancé, and both sides waged unofficial war in the Vexin. Further complicating the situation, Geoffrey's wife Constance turned out to be pregnant and gave birth to a son. Breaking with tradition, Constance named him Arthur, which was a minor rebellion, since Henry wanted his first male grandson to be named after him. Constance proved to be an able ruler, but Henry had little interest in an effective ruler unless she was willing to follow his wishes. She wasn't, so he married her to Ranulph of Chester in early 1189, after waiting until the Earl had come of age. Chester was chosen because his lands in Normandy bordered northeastern Brittany, and his lands in Lincolnshire were mixed in with the estate of Richmond. The marriage was intended to keep Constance's independent nature under control and to prevent Philip from extending his influence into Brittany. It does not seem to have been a happy relationship. They spent little time together since Ranulph was usually in England or Normandy, and they produced no children. Since John was young, the obvious solution would be to name Richard as his sole heir, but Henry seemed to have believed that no other single person could rule the entire Angevin Federation. Honestly, the situation resembles the refusal of a founder of a family-owned corporation to hand over authority to his heirs. Testing Angevin willingness to fight, Philip laid siege to a powerful fortress in Betty, a disputed territory between Aquitaine and southern France, in the summer of 1187, which brought Henry and Richard together to repel the invasion. The two armies faced each other at Châteauroux on June 23rd, and a decisive, possibly catastrophic battle seemed likely as envoys frantically shuttled between the two camps. Neither king wanted to risk a battle, but neither wanted to lose face. However, their vassals probably did not want to risk their lives in an unnecessary battle, so Henry finally gave in, granting Philip 2 of the disputed lordships, and the two sides agreed to a 2-year truce. Taking note of Richard's strange relationship with his father, Philip decided to woo him. He even employed the Count of Flanders to deliver a personal message during the negotiations at Châteauroux. Richard proved receptive, traveling to Paris, where Philip continued to court him. The situation changed when news arrived that Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in October, since Richard answered the Pope's call for a crusade, forcing Henry and Philip to agree as well, even though both men preferred to focus on their kingdoms rather than drain their treasuries and risk their lives to fight in someone else's land far, far away. The crusade would be expensive, leading to a Saladin tax in England. Recruitment of knights boomed following the announcement that knights who took the cross and went on crusade would not have to pay the Saladin tax. Lengthy negotiations were required to work out the thorny issue of rivals leaving their kingdoms at the same time. Despite mounting criticism from the clergy and the increasing financial burden of keeping armies ready to fight, several conferences between Philip, Richard, and Henry failed to achieve a lasting peace that would enable everyone to go on crusade. In fact, Philip signaled that he was fed up with pointless negotiation by chopping down the elm tree that marked the traditional meeting point on the border of the two kingdoms. Instead of uniting for the crusade, the simmering conflict between the two dynasties flamed into open warfare, which did not come as a surprise since Philip was determined to reclaim France's dominance over the regions held by the Angevin Dynasty. At the same time, he wanted his half-sister Alice's position to be resolved. Rumors that she'd become Henry's mistress were no doubt unwelcome. To be honest, Philip was likely far more concerned with the promised dowry than his half-sister's happiness. Following Geoffrey's death, Philip's sole hope of smooth cooperation was Richard's long-delayed marriage to Alice, but Henry seems to have missed its importance, making no effort to actually arrange the marriage, or at least reassure Philip that it would happen. Henry probably thought that Philip would not go to war over it, but ignored the return of Philip's uncles, the Counts of Champagne and Blois, to the court, as well as France's growing strength. Admittedly, Philip was not as powerful as Henry, but the gap between them was shrinking. Count Philip had already weakened Flanders in a gamble to gain influence over the young King of France. The gamble proved to be a major mistake since Philip gained independence as he grew older and worked to limit the influence of the Count of Flanders. The two men had struggled over the county of Vermandois, but the king emerged victorious in 1185 thanks to the support of his father-in-law, Count Baldwin of Hainaut, who decided to ensure his daughter's interest rather than aid his brother-in-law. Count Philip agreed to keep only part of Vermandois for his lifetime, while Philip received Amiens, changing the balance of power between Flanders and France. 2 years later, the French queen gave birth to a son, ensuring that Philip would inherit his wife's dowry of Artois when the Count of Flanders died. Moreover, the French economy had been growing throughout the 12th century, but the pace greatly increased after 1180. Wheat had replaced rye and barley as crops, while the introduction of heavy iron plows that were drawn by horses instead of oxen enabled farmers to cultivate more land. At the same time, the nobles and the king managed their lands better, and towns grew both in number and size, reflecting the greater amount of goods being traded. Lords who did not adopt more efficient management techniques found themselves poorer, and thus less able to oppose the king or resist efforts by towns and rural communities to demand greater privileges or even the status of communes, where they were permitted to manage their own affairs. An expansionist French king was a threat, but not a fatal one, as long as Henry could rely on the support of his heir. Unfortunately, Henry's relationship with Richard had been strained nearly to the breaking point. One key factor was Richard's suspicion that Henry had decided to let John succeed him when Richard was conveniently absent on crusade. It seems likely that Henry simply used John as a method of controlling Richard and refused to stop, even as it drove Richard to rebellion. It is unclear how much of the final conflict between Henry and Richard was due to Henry's inability to accept not getting what he wanted. While he would be generous to a beaten opponent, he reacted with fury when denied. Henry would soon face the consequences of his actions. When Richard and Philip arrived together for a conference on November 18, 1188, Henry refused Richard's demands that he become official heir to Normandy in England, gain control of other Angevin territories, and marry Alice, ignoring the clear and present danger. Henry responded it was blackmail, causing Richard to pay homage to Philip as Duke of Aquitaine. On the surface, Henry retained his authority, but many of his barons recognized his declining position even if he didn't. It should have become clear when many of his vassals sent excuses rather than attend his annual Christmas celebration. However, Philip grasped the situation and launched serious raids along the border. Henry sent numerous envoys to Richard in the hopes of a last-minute reconciliation, but more than a decade of Henry's scheming had produced a genuine mistrust in Richard. Finally, Henry met with Richard and Philip on May 28th, but refused to make any concessions, so it would be war. It would be difficult to explain Henry's rash behavior, which drove Richard to rebel, other than he had been scheming all of his life and just did not know how to stop. The simple explanation is that Henry had become old and stubborn. Whether Henry's mind was slipping because of age or he simply did not want to acknowledge his own mortality is irrelevant. He had driven Richard into Philip's arms. While the situation appeared similar to the young king's rebellion, Henry was older and Richard was a much better general than the young king. Richard and Philip then attacked Normandy, and the old king was too frail to lead a campaign, leaving command of much of the fighting to his loyal retainer, William Marshal. Ill, Henry slowly made his way to the great fortress of Chinon in Anjou, while the nearby counties of Maine and Touraine quickly fell. While the Great Revolt had lasted 18 months, and Henry the Younger's second revolt was 4 months, Richard had emerged victorious in a little over a month. When Richard and Philip arrived at Chinon on July 4th, Henry rode out of the castle to meet his son and his rival. Barely able to sit on a horse, Henry could only agree to Philip's terms, pay homage to Philip for all of his continental lands, acknowledge Richard as his heir, permit Richard to marry Alice when he returned from the crusade, hand over vital castles as security, and pay Philip 20,000 marks as compensation for his inconvenience. Exhausted, he had to be transported back to the castle in a litter. 2 days later, Henry learned that even John had joined Philip. Heartbroken, he died later that day. Henry's reign was essentially a series of revolts caused by his greed and ambition. However, it can be argued that he was a good king of England, or rather, he recognized that the Kingdom of England was the core of his possessions, so his legal reforms introduced stability, and his efficient government provided him with enough money to fund his endless campaigns to extend his continental domains. In an era where agreements were based on oaths, a public statement of intent, rather than a matter to be resolved in impartial courts, Henry's habit of essentially disavowing his intent made enemies and caused people to distrust him, which explains much of the conflict with his sons. Richard suddenly found himself ruler of the Angevin Federation as he prepared to go on crusade. I will explain how he handled his unexpected promotion and his involvement in the Third Crusade next episode. Thanks for listening.